have your Bibles with you, the scripture reading this morning is from John chapter 18, from verses 15 to 18. John chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood out at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. That's John chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. Whether you are young, whether you are middle-aged, or whether you are, how can I say this, seasoned in life. How about that? That works? That Crescent's like, yeah, there you go. You know what it's like, or you will know what it's like to fail. And we all struggle with this idea of failure, because I don't really know of too many people who wake up in the morning and get out of bed, and whether it's they get ready for school, or they get ready for a sports activity, or they get ready to go to work, they wake up in the morning and say, "Oh man, let's go get ready to fail today." I don't know too many people like that. There might be somebody that's out there like that, but I don't know too many people who do that. And so when we do fail, the question that we ask is, why? And what's so interesting about that question is that we never answer it. We just ask the question, why? And then what seems to happen with people who fail and fail again and never can really right the ship is that they don't learn from their failures. Now, I think it's so interesting when you look at somebody like Michael Jordan. Everybody remembers Michael Jordan for being a 6-time NBA champion and a 6-time Finals MVP champion. And they say, well, he's the greatest player of all time. And that very well may be true. But how many people talk about all the years before 1993, before 1992, before 1991 even? How many people sit back and when they remember Michael Jordan, they remember him as a great baseball player? Not too many people. Not too many people talk about his stint with the Barons, who were the Triple-A baseball team in which he played for, in which he batted under 200. Not many people care to talk about that between the time he got into the league in his rookie season and between that time in 1991, he really didn't make it very far often in the playoffs. He was losing to guys like Isaiah Thomas. He was losing to guys like Larry Bird's Celtics. But when they show interviews of Michael Jordan, he'll tell them that those years before the three-peat of 91, 92, 93, that those years facing the Pistons and those years facing the Celtics and those years failing, while it wasn't desired, allowed him to learn from his failures, allow that team to learn from their mistakes, allow the team to fill in the gaps of where they were weak so that they could become champions. I can remember the first time where I was devastated by failure. First time I can recall. I'm sure before this time I failed multiple ways, but the biggest thing that as a kid that just encompassed and that was just the focus of my life, take a guess. Golf, right? For those of you who know me, golf was the epicenter of my life. I would do whatever it took, within the rules obviously, to win. And I can remember there was this one kid, and I don't remember his last name, but there was this junior kind of tour that was going on in Virginia, in the Piedmont section of Virginia, where it was from 10 different counties in the area, and you would travel from county to county over a 12-week period, and you would play in golf tournaments. In order to qualify for the final, you either had to play in 4 tournaments or win one. And I can remember there was this one kid that would always, his name was Trey, that would always talk to everybody about how great he was. And you know what it's like to encounter those kind of people. It just drives you to want to just put it back in their face one time. And I can remember I was playing with him in a tournament in Amelia Country Club. And it was he and I, and we were in the same group. And between 16, 17, and 18, all I had to do was make a par or a bogey on the last 3 holes, and I had it locked up. And I went double, double, double to shoot 50. I was 10, shot 50. He beat me by 3 shots, 47. Devastated at failure. Because I had it locked, I had it cinched. What do you mean? I know how good I am, and I know what I want to do. I see the goal, I can achieve it, and then mistake, very last hole, hit it out of bounds, 3-putted the last green, I'm done. Failure. And it's in those moments of failure where we find out not just our faults, but our character is revealed in the moments in which we fail. Because think about it for a second. There's really no need to self-assess. There's really no need to adjust when everything's going good. I mean, think about the great companies that succeed, and then all of a sudden they're no longer top dog. Well, why aren't they top dog? Well, because they never saw it coming. Same thing can happen spiritually. Sometimes spiritually, we think things are going so great. Things are going so well, and we never take the time to evaluate, to assess, and then before you know it, boom. We found ourselves in a situation, we found ourselves in a circumstance in which we have spiritually failed. And so then the question is, why? Michael Jordan asked the question over and over and over again, why? After that tournament, I asked the question over and over and over again, why did this happen? What took place? Was it nerves? Was it technique? Was it just the being overhyped about the competition? And while the question why is a good question, it does us no good if we never find and seek the solution. And so when we don't find it, when we don't seek the solution, what often happens for you and I is that we are defined, or we define ourselves by the failures that happen. Our life is only defined by that failure. You know, this is going to sound weird, but to a certain degree, I admire Charles Barkley. Not because of anything Charles Barkley has said, certainly not because of anything Charles Barkley has done outside of the basketball court, but because Charles Barkley in his life will always be known as one of the greatest players to what? Never win a championship. Patrick Ewing, one of the greatest players to ever live, will be defined by the fact, people will define him as somebody who could never win the big one. Phil Mickelson in golf will always be defined, unless he does it in the next couple of years, by the player that was so great but never won a U.S. Open. But those things don't define who they are. And we're going to read about a person who is world famous then, who is world famous now, and will always be famous. And that man has the name Peter. And we all know the story of Peter. We all know the certain things that Peter like that guy where you look at him and you say, oh, that's just Peter. And in John chapter 18, we see and we experience and we feel the failure of Peter. And the question that we're going to look at and the question that we're going to try and answer this morning is, why did Peter fail? And not that Peter went out and he looked for failure. And this sermon is not one to say, you know, in order for you to get more spiritual, you just need to go out and you just need to pursue failure. That's not the point. All of us should pursue the righteousness of God. But in those moments when we do fail, we should ask the question why. And whether you believe it or not, hopefully we can tease this out this morning. But in those moments of failure, that can actually help our faith. And I know some of you are skeptical, but just stay with me. And so in John chapter 18, the context that is set here really goes back to that moment when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. And in Matthew chapter 26:35, when Jesus talks about the fact that he's going to be arrested, he talks about the fact that he is going to leave them and he is going to die, nobody says anything except Peter. Peter's the one that stands up and says, even if all of them fall away on the account of you, I will not. I will die for you. And given the Jewish mentality and given the Jewish understanding, as we've talked about here from the pulpit and also, in classes, the Jewish mentality is this Messiah that's come is supposed to give the Romans the boot and restore the kingdom of David, restore the kingdom of Solomon. And so in John chapter 18, what's taken place is Jesus has been arrested. Jesus has been taken before Annas and Caiaphas. And the mentality is, wait, time out. This is not supposed to happen. This was not according to plan. And so nobody in their right Jewish mind, following this guy that was able to make blind men see, to make to heal lepers, to speak in such a way that caused people to draw unto him. He's not supposed to be the one that's supposed to be arrested. He's not the one that's supposed to be on trial. And certainly, he's not the one that's supposed to die. And so in this moment, Peter and his statement from Matthew chapter 26:35 is put to the test. And notice what takes place. It says that Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. This disciple, seems to be John. And so in verse 17 it says, the servant girl at the door. I find that so interesting. Because what takes place is a very simple question. This girl didn't ask Peter to prove the existence of God, of Yahweh. This girl didn't ask for the complete lineage of Jesus in order for him to show that he was a disciple. And on the other hand of it, this isn't even, at this point in the story, a Roman centurion. This isn't the great high priest. This isn't a scribe. This isn't a Pharisee. This isn't a member of the Sanhedrin. It's a servant girl. See, oftentimes the reason that we fail isn't because we're in a situation where we're being pressed by people of authority, but we're under pressure from the circumstances around us. There's nothing that this servant girl could do to Peter. It's not as if this servant girl was going to, kill Peter with a knife. And she asks this question. She says, you also are not are you? There it is. There's the question. And the pressure comes from what is going on around Peter. Up to this point, the only two people that have followed Jesus are John and Peter. And he has just seen with his very own eyes his leader, his master, his teacher, this Messiah be arrested. And later he's going to watch him die. But the question, you're not one of his disciples, are you? And that's a question that is still pressed upon us today amidst everything that is going on around us. You take a look at what's taking place. There's a BuzzFeed article that went in and this week, and those of you who know Chip and Joanna Gaines from Fixer Upper, woohoo! I come home to that every single day. It's true. I feel like Bill Murray and Groundhog's Day. But without even asking Chip and Joanna Gaines what they thought about a specific social issue, they did a hit piece on them because their preacher had said something that didn't agree with what the society around them thought was acceptable. And so at some point, Chip and Joanna Gaines are going to have to answer this question. At some point, you and I are going to have to answer this question. You're not one of those disciples, are you? You're not one of those Jesus freaks, are you? You don't really believe the Bible literally means this about this, do you? And it might not come from your boss. It might not come from a coworker. It might come from somebody else's kid. And you have to answer. And I have to answer. And Peter allows, the reason that Peter caves here is because of the pressure around him. Well, if he says yes, and he's here, as he's followed Jesus to the court of the high priest, he's not exactly in favorable territory. If he answers yes, there's a possibility that the servant girl who's there will turn him in. And there's a possibility that the officers around him will turn him in. And certainly Peter does not want, at this point as we see, to undergo the same things that Jesus is about to undergo. And so what does he say? He says, I am not. And so he caves to the pressure of the situation and the circumstances around him. And we face a culture and a society, whether that's in the church or whether that's outside the church, where in asking that question, there is a certain amount of ridicule that is certainly going to come your way, that's certainly going to come my way. And as we've talked about on Wednesday night, all those who desire to live godly will face persecution. And so Peter fails because of the pressure. And also the reason that Peter fails is because he's made a statement previously in Matthew chapter 26 that he didn't know the absolute answer to. In that moment in Matthew chapter 26, I'm convinced that Peter makes that statement simply to stand out. Simply to say, Jesus, I'm yours. But they can all go ahead, they can all fall away. But you know what? I'm your guy. And I'll never abandon you. Did Peter know for certain that that was the case? No, because he had never been put in that situation. And so we have to be careful that when we face certain circumstances and situations that we are not familiar with, that our pride doesn't cause us to make statements that we don't know the answer to. Because then when the pressure comes, When you mix the pride with the pressure of the circumstances and situations around you, and we're not prepared for that, we're in trouble. Thirdly, I don't necessarily know that Peter fully understood this Messiah deal. I'm convinced that Peter, like most Jews, was saying, hey, this Messiah is supposed to be this warlord king. And even later in the Gospels, it's not even to the book of Acts where it finally clicks with the disciples about who Jesus is and what the nature of the kingdom is supposed to be. And so another reason why we might fail spiritually is because we don't necessarily fully grasp the weight and the gravity of who Jesus is and what he wants and what he's communicated. And so we fail. Our pride tells us that we're perfect. Our pride tells us that we have all the answers. Our pride tells us that we can make crazy statements about situations and circumstances that we haven't faced. And then when we face them, like Peter, we stick our foot in our mouth. And we fail. And this isn't the first time this happens. Take a look with me in verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? That is the second time he has been asked. And he denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? And Peter again denied it at once. The rooster crowed. And from this point to the end of John, when we follow through to the end of John, we see Peter in a state that is so vulnerable, that is so destroyed, that he is crumbled. He goes back to doing what he used to do as a fisherman. And so often, when we find ourselves in a spiritual circumstance or a spiritual situation where we're not where we used to be or we're not where we want to be, we allow those failures that take place over and over and over again. We throw up our hands in the air and we say, well, that's just me and there's nothing I can do about it. How many people do you know who are like that? They say it's just too tough, it's just too hard to overcome, I just can't do it anymore. And what is so interesting about Peter is that he's in that spot. He is that vulnerable at the end of John. To the point where when Jesus tells him he loves him 3 times, Peter weeps. And Peter grieves that Jesus asks the question, do you love me? And if that's the end of the story, then there is no hope. But what's so interesting is that when you look later in Peter's life, turn with me to 1 Peter chapter 1. When you look later in Peter's life, you see a completely and totally different person than what we see in the Gospel of John. Now, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1 says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus. He has actually claimed himself to be a messenger now of Jesus Christ. And notice what he says in verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father, our Lord of Jesus Christ, according to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Christ from the dead. You don't think Peter is writing this through the reflective lens of his experiences and his situation that he's been through? He knows literally what it's like to be spiritually, emotionally dead on the basis of what had taken place years ago. And so what changed between John, the book of John, and 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 and 4? Well, the first thing that took place is that in that situation in which he faced, Peter was humbled. by his failure. While we don't seek failure, while nobody wants to fail, in those moments in which we do fall short, they should humble us. Because when I am humbled by my failures and I realize what has taken place, it allows me, it gives me an opportunity to sit back and reflect and ask the question, what went wrong? And in Peter's situation, what he looks at and what he sees and what he calculates, he says, you know what? I caved to pressure. I caved to people. I caved to a servant girl. Because I didn't fully understand what was going on. And isn't it interesting that after Jesus, in the resurrection account, when Jesus comes back and he talks to Peter, isn't it interesting that on the basis of now who he knows, what Peter knows about Jesus, he's then able to stand on the day of Pentecost amidst multiple Jews and say, this is who Jesus is. You want to talk about pressure? Right here you had a small courtyard of officers and servants. On the day of Pentecost, you had people coming from all over the world to the epicenter of Judaism in Jerusalem. And Peter stands before that crowd. The same crowd who he would later go on to say, you, let the house of Israel know that it is you who have crucified the Christ who's known as Jesus. And I'm paraphrasing there. You want to talk about the possibility of being thrown in jail. You want to talk about the possibility of being stoned. Possibility is still there in Jerusalem. And so he understood that he caved to the pressure. And the other thing that he understood is he had, in my failure, he understood that he was not who he thought he was. See, in Matthew chapter 26, Peter makes a statement that would indicate that he is this brave soldier of Jesus that will do whatever it takes to see to it that he's still around. And Peter finds out in a very hard way that he's not. And so when I fail, not only do I have a chance to go back and reflect and ask the question, what happened, I also understand that there's a part of me, there's a piece of me that isn't whole, that isn't complete, that there's something missing, that I'm not who maybe I thought I was. And it gives me the opportunity to reflect on that and to adjust that. Notice what he says. A living hope through the resurrection of Christ from the dead to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you. Now notice verse 6. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. He's talking to people who are being persecuted, and he looks out and he says, I've been there. I've done that. I've experienced those ups. I've experienced those downs. And so when I fail and I adjust myself spiritually, I have the opportunity to make, as the famous saying goes, to turn my misery into a ministry. And that's exactly what Peter does to these people who are facing intense pressure, intense persecution. You don't think Peter knows what it's like to be put in jail? Yeah, he does. And one of the faults that we have in 21st century Christianity is that there's this idea that if you fail spiritually and you miss the mark spiritually, while you can recover and while you can recuperate through repentance and getting back to God, you're never allowed to talk about it. Under the guise of, well, we just don't want to promote sin. But what I see from Peter in 1 Peter chapter 1 is he's definitely talking about trials and tribulations, and he's going to later go on and talk about suffering. He talks about the things that he's experienced so that he can help people around him that he's concerned about get through their struggle. And so when I fail, I have the opportunity to reflect, I have the opportunity to adjust, and I have the opportunity to help people who've experienced the same thing that I have experienced. You know, up until last week, I didn't know what it was like to have a father undergo quadruple bypass. I didn't know what it was like to experience that pressure. And I'm not pointing fingers at me, but some of you have had experiences that nobody else has had. But you might encounter somebody that will. Some of you have experienced personal demons and failures spiritually that you have come back from. And you have found your way back into a relationship with God. That I can't experience, that people around you can't experience, but one day you might find somebody and come across somebody that is going through that exact same thing. We should not quell our ability to talk about how we overcame our failures. And so ultimately, as you tie all of this together, while we don't seek failure, while we know that failure is not a good thing, failure can help our faith. And finally, when I fail, it helps me understand the mercy and the grace of God. We live in a world where self is the God of the universe. It's the greatest idol you'll ever encounter. It's the greatest battle you'll ever experience. And so what happens when that idol falls? We see at the end of John where Jesus says 3 times to Peter, I agape you. He asks the question, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And Peter says, yes, I love you. Yes, I love you. Yes, I love you. And after each one of those affirmations, Jesus gives Peter a mission. In essence, he's telling Peter, don't worry about this failure back here. Worry about the mission that is set before you on the basis of the fact that I have forgiven you and that I love you. And isn't it interesting, the greatest failure of us is us. And that in that failure, God steps down onto the earth and he still says, I want you. It blows my mind. Every single time I think about the message of the gospel. And so in verse 13, after Peter relays this to those who he's writing to, he says, therefore prepare your minds for action. And being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. I don't know where you are this morning. Maybe you feel like you're just in a season of spiritual failure. And maybe you walk around your workspace, maybe you walk around school, maybe you walk around your family, and you just feel like, man, I'm only defined by my failure. The beauty of the gospel and the beauty of Jesus, he says, you're no longer defined by your failures because guess what? I know you're going to fail. But you're defined by me and I am perfect. And on the account of that, we should set our minds to action. That this message that we have, this message of hope and of grace and of blessing on the basis of Jesus stepping in my place for my sin, is something that we can latch and we can anchor our lives to. And it doesn't matter how many times we fail, as long as we come back to Him, He says, I've got you covered. Do you live in that? Or do you question it? This morning, Christ calls us to put our failures in the past, to lay those at the foot of the cross and take hold of the hope that's found in the resurrection. And if you do that, and if we do that, notice what takes place in the church when they anchor themselves to that. They don't cave to the pressure that's around them. They don't cave to the circumstances and situations, to the various trials or the various struggles that they come upon. They say, in light of all those things, Jesus is my hope, Jesus is my anchor, and I will find security, I will find hope, I will find joy, I will find ultimate peace in that. And therefore, it's not that I have to let people know, I must let people know. And you tell me who can stop a church with that mindset. There's not a thing, a person, a government, a circumstance, or situation that can stop that. Do you have that this morning? Or do you find yourself constantly caving to the pressure? Which one is it? My prayer for us this morning is that we would allow, not that we would seek out failure, but that when we fail, we would go back and we would reflect, we would adjust, and we would think and live in such a way that those failures don't define us, but the hope of Jesus consumes us. And even those failures help our faith. Do you have a relationship with Jesus this morning? Because if you don't, you'll walk around your life defining yourself by situations and circumstances. Jesus is a guarantee. Let's think about that this morning as we stand.